these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast.
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey guys, welcome back. Greatest podcast ever. And please give it 5 stars if you haven't already. Look, pop quiz. What was worse, the year 2020 or the year 2021? Well, it's a tough choice. The year 2021 has been pretty bad. Year 2020 was also pretty bad. It was more surprising to us. And I think the surprising thing about 2021 is how we can't seem to solve the problems that were imposed upon us in the year 2020. And that is largely due to the Biden administration, if I may say so myself. So on this podcast, I want to go over what has happened in 2021 from a policy perspective. This is going to get wonky. You're going to get a lot of facts here. We're going to hit a lot of different issues: energy, COVID response, inflation, the Build Back Better socialist spending plan, supply chain crisis, crime wave, Biden's failed nominees, Supreme Court failures for the Biden administration, Afghanistan, the border, all of it. We're just doing a recap of the year 2021 as we look into hopefully better times in the year 2022. So where do we begin? Let's look to energy. This is important to me. Obviously, I represent the Houston area, energy capital of the world. And it's no secret to anybody that Americans are paying the highest at the pump in 7 years. We've faced the biggest surge in electricity costs since 2009. And instead of signing emergency measures to increase energy production, the president has instead made it harder to be an oil and gas producer in the United States. He's blamed all sorts of things: corporate greed, collusion, the OPEC cartel, oil exports, the fact that we even use oil and gas in the first place. And he's proposed foolish things like eliminating exports. And he's proposed things that really have no effect, like releasing barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which ended up being about 2.5 days worth of American domestic use. So not exactly a big effect. Remember, they bragged about a 2-cent decrease in gas prices, which probably had nothing to do with their actions at all, and was, of course, at the tail end of multi-dollar increases previous to that. And of course, they got made fun of and dragged on social media for it. Let's go over real quick what the president has exactly done to harm the oil and gas industry. It's not just rhetoric. So upon taking office on January 26th, the president issued an executive order that paused oil and gas lease sales. This canceled the quarterly lease sales that were planned. If they want to increase oil production, they might want to stop this unlawful pause. Now, luckily, a judge overturned it, but those lease sales only were reinstated in November. That's last month. Okay, so if you want to understand why there's a lack of production, a lack of investment in production, there are certain actions the president has done to contribute to that. They also canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. Everybody remembers that. That would have transported crude oil from Canada to the United States. Also results in Houston businesses losing $800 million in revenue. What does it do for the environment? Nothing. I mean, that's always their cause for this, right? We're helping the environment. We're going to make all the weather just like San Diego. And that's why we're doing this. It's worth it. It's worth the cost. But of course it's not, and it won't change the weather. But they believe it is. Now, here's the thing. Pipeline transportation is always safer than any other kind of transportation of oil. It's not like the Canadians are going to produce less oil. They're just going to ship it elsewhere. And they'll use trucks and they'll use rail. And these things have a long history of safety issues that pipelines simply don't. The Biden administration also stopped oil exploration in Alaska, which resulted in losses for Houston companies, as well as a loss again in crude oil production, which of course contributes to a lack of supply and higher prices. Biden also ordered our development banks to stop supporting American oil and gas companies who are trying to work with other countries who want to mirror America's success in producing gas at higher environmental standards. A classic example of this was in Vietnam recently. Given the density in Vietnam, you're not going to build a bunch of solar panels everywhere. What they need is gas exploration, and what they need is American gas exploration. This could be mutually beneficial in a number of ways. One, decreasing reliance on China in these Asian countries and bringing them closer into the American field of influence, but also good for our business. What else did Biden do? Made it harder for oil and gas companies to permit projects by undoing permitting modernization that was begun under the Trump administration. So look, I say this about infrastructure all the time. If you're going to build infrastructure, if you're going to spend money on it, then make it easier to build infrastructure. If you want to stop flaring gas, which means just burning it, you see these big flames out in the middle of West Texas, in the middle of nowhere. If you want to stop doing that, then you need to allow pipelines to be built easier and permitted easier so that you can get that gas out and make it more useful. For instance, there's a lot of solutions to a lot of the smaller problems that we have. But if you attack the industry wholesale, you'll probably end up increasing emissions and increasing our gas prices. Biden also grandfathered in these smaller mom-and-pop oil wells into new emission requirements, which means they would have to require them to purchase thousands of dollars of new equipment for oil wells that really only produce a tiny bit of oil, don't really have an effect on the environmental problems that they're talking about. But it's still about 8% of the nation's oil, so it does have an effect on prices. And then, counterintuitively, Biden has asked OPEC to increase production. So you got to wonder, is this really about emissions? What is this about? Or you just hate American business? I mean, what is your problem? They also approved the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is just a giveaway to Russian interests. I don't know why we would do that. Again, if we cared about America first policy and American interests, we would be pressuring our European allies to buy more American gas. That's what we would be doing. All right, this isn't going to cause a war with Russia. Okay, and I need to say that to some people on our side. There's a lot of foreign policy in between all-out war and doing nothing. It's time we actually engage in foreign policy with a bit of nuance instead of these declarations of black and white statements. What else have they done? These are the things that are in process on the oil and gas industry. They're looking at revoking decisions to let oil and gas lease on federal land. The Biden administration is still fighting that. They're also trying to change what we call demand factors, basically signaling to oil and gas producers there's going to be less demand for their product, so they have less likelihood to produce it. That includes changes to the vehicle emissions rules, for instance, which phases out cars that use gasoline, also changes to the renewable fuel standard, which would punish refiners for making gasoline. The SEC is changing climate disclosures, which would require banks to limit lending to private oil and gas companies, even if the loan is for technology that would limit methane emissions. It's just, again, counterintuitive. So really what the Biden administration wants to do is take these ESG standards, environmental, societal, and governance standards that are more of a cultural movement really within the investment world and create policy out of that, which would really direct investors away from companies that hold any interest in or serve oil and gas companies. Again, so what are you really doing here? You're removing capital from the industry, making sure they don't produce, making sure our prices stay high. That's the end result here. Now, let's move on to something that's been in the news a lot lately, which is Biden's COVID response. By all metrics, cases, deaths, Biden's COVID response has been a failure, if those are the metrics that we care about. Remember, Trump was called a murderer day in and day out because people were dying from a global pandemic that started in China. Okay, as if he could just take action that would prevent such a thing, as if it was easy. Now, of course, he did take some pretty significant actions that were declared racist at the times, like banning travel from China, and of course, he did take action like fund Operation Warp Speed, which created these sort of miracle vaccines. I know there's a lot of disagreement on the vaccines, but President Trump certainly still stands by that. But what has Biden really done? Now, to be fair, he's done what I really would expect him to do, which is as little as possible. All right. I think we should stop with the action-oriented hubris that indicates that we should do everything possible to minimize risk to zero. Now, what I don't like that Biden has done is these excessive mandates and continuing to fight to impose this OSHA mandate that would fine businesses who do not fire workers because of their vaccine status. That is unbelievable overreach, and luckily the Supreme Court should be hearing that case within a matter, I think, the first week of January, and hopefully overturn it. I for one have some confidence that they will, but let's not make any predictions. So, it's worth noting that the difficult problems were already solved by the time Biden took office. He had vaccines available. All he had to do was get them to people, and they were distributed in a pretty efficient manner. I think as efficient as you possibly can. There was advanced treatments available, like monoclonal antibody treatments or Regeneron. A lot of these things had passed the sniff test and were already in the process, and yet the failures still occurred. And look, what's the moral of the story here? Again, it's that the Biden administration and Democrats owe the Trump administration an apology, because there's only so much you can do in the face of a global pandemic. That's the actual story here. Inflation. Let's talk about inflation, because this is what is really harming Americans. It's a hidden tax, and it's a hidden tax on working class families especially. You're seeing everything cost more, and it's especially hurting you during the holidays and really in every way. Now, worth noting, why is this happening? Why is inflation happening? I think for a couple reasons, primarily because of lockdowns. I continue to say that lockdowns are the primary cause of this. So did Biden impose lockdowns? No, not necessarily. But it was certainly Democrat politicians that did, and are now continuing to do so, putting a chilling effect on businesses by making it harder for them to hire because of these vaccine mandates, for instance. So these kind of things create a production bottleneck. When you have less production of any kind of good, prices are going to go up because demand is still skyrocketing. We do not have a demand problem in this country. In fact, the demand problem was made a little bit worse, again, by Democrat policies. When Biden did take office, they passed the American Rescue Plan, which, again, put an excessive amount of social spending into the economy. There was a statistic out there that Americans have like 4 times the amount of money in their bank accounts than they did prior to the pandemic. So there's a lot of excessive money out there to spend. It causes prices to go up. And the supply chains that were permanently disfigured by lockdowns cannot keep up. Okay, that's fundamentally, I think, what's happening. And as a result, we've seen inflation surge almost 7% in November, its fastest rate since 1982. Even real wage growth has been decimated by this. Real wage growth means, your wage growth, but as compared to inflation. And because of this inflation, we've basically lost that last 3 years of real wage growth that happened after the Trump tax cuts. And it's worth noting, if inflation persists at the current rate, households will lose $1,700 in real wages by the end of President Biden's first year in office. You compare that to the increase in median wages under Trump, which was, I think, the most in history. It was thousands of dollars, and really outsized. It was abnormal what happened under the Trump administration. Again, for very simple reasons: an easier regulatory environment, pro-business regulatory environment, plus tax cuts. During October, inflation increased by an annualized 12%, not seen since 1980. Okay, we can go through a bunch of these statistics, but they're not entirely useful. I think it's important for conservatives really to get the reasoning right. Now let's talk about the Build Back Better plan, which luckily failed. And the Build Back Better plan would have been hyperinflationary. Again, always important to note the difference between the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill. Pretty different pieces of legislation. The infrastructure bill is probably not inflationary. Most economists would agree with that. Infrastructure spending in general is not necessarily inflationary. What is inflationary is something like the Build Back Better plan, because it's just putting more spending money in people's pockets when they don't necessarily need it at that moment. I call it a bribery plan, right? It's just bribing you for your votes. And it also makes it very hard to take those programs away, even though they're temporary, because people feel like they have an entitlement now. And look, that's a deeper cultural problem in America that we have to sort out, where we finally refuse to be bribed by government for more and more services, more and more programs. It's not a sustainable model for a number of reasons, both culturally and financially. Financially, it's not sustainable, I think, for obvious reasons. You're demanding things that somebody else is refusing to pay for, basically, and we don't want to raise taxes enough to actually pay for it. That's one problem. But I think culturally it's detrimental because, well, on a deeper level, it makes us softer, makes us more reliant and less willing to take our own risks and take our own responsibility. And I think a society ultimately decays when you do that. That's the fundamental spiritual problem, if you will, with the Build Back Better plan. Now, luckily, it's sort of dead, sort of dead. I think eventually they'll pass something that I don't like, but in its current form, it's certainly dead. Now, how did this happen? Well, everybody is glad that Joe Manchin did what he did. I am too, but let's dig a little deeper into the strategy here and the steps that led up to this. Now, I voted against the infrastructure bill because it was too expensive. People throw out this idea that it was not really an infrastructure bill. It actually was. I think it was just too expensive, and it didn't do enough to decrease the permitting timelines for infrastructure. Again, if you're going to spend money on infrastructure, make it easier to build infrastructure. So I was against it. I was also against the debt ceiling increase. But it's worth noting that those two things passing and really under the strategy of Mitch McConnell in the Senate, those two things passing are the only reason that Joe Manchin was able to stand up to the Build Back Better plan. Because what they did was effectively, okay, you have this larger spending package combined, the infrastructure bill with the Build Back Better nonsense, the human infrastructure, if you will, is what they called it. And you take out the good stuff, and as Mitch McConnell puts it, you leave them with the spinach, and you see if they'll swallow it. And of course, they wouldn't. And the American people didn't want to swallow it either. It's very unpopular. So by taking that out, by taking the good stuff out, which is 70% approval throughout the country, and by not creating a crisis with the debt limit, because look, it's one thing to shut down the government, guys. It's quite another to allow the debt limit to default effectively and cause an economic crisis almost immediately. So that's two very different things. When you take those out of the equation, you remove any kind of blame on the Republican Party for this, and you remove any leverage that more progressive Democrats had on Joe Manchin. Well, you get this outcome where even with complete control of the Senate, the House, and the presidency, the Democrats still can't pass their favored bill, right? All of their favorite progressive legislation. Even the progressives noted this strategy early on, which is why they were so against passing the infrastructure bill, was because they knew they needed that as leverage to get somebody like Manchin and Kristen Sinema to vote for it. And they knew they lost that when they passed the infrastructure bill. So again, did I vote against those things? Yes. But do I see the strategy behind it? Yes. And you'd be foolish not to observe that. Now, we could talk a little bit about the Build Back Better plan, what was in it. Look, I've got a lot of facts here. It was really, really large, multi-trillions of dollars, depending on what estimate you're using, up to $5 trillion, because based on the notion that it's very hard to end these programs once they're started. Now, interestingly enough, large tax increases, but also large tax decreases for blue state rich people. For instance, because of the SALT cap, increased the SALT cap to $80,000, which would increase the number of millionaires who receive a tax cut in liberal states. The SALT cap basically allows you to deduct your state and local taxes from your ultimate tax bill. And so states that primarily affects states with high income taxes like New York, New Jersey, California, those kind of places. So on top of those benefits for blue state elites, I mean, you also have an additional $1.2 trillion in taxes, which about $412 billion in taxes on small businesses. This is the last thing America needs. What does it do with all that money? I mean, for instance, gives $80 billion to the IRS to double the number of agents targeting Americans. Like, this speaks to a complete philosophical difference in governance. You know, we think the tax code should be simpler so that you don't have to double the number of workers at the IRS to actually go through the complicated process of audits and making sure that our tax code is being enforced properly. I think the government should be well equipped to do very simple things well. That's a philosophical governance difference between us and the Democrats. Democrats think you should just keep expanding it and keep making things more complicated, and then hiring more federal workers and bureaucracy in order to deal with those complications. That's really what's behind this $80 billion number for the IRS to double its agents. I don't know why they think that would be popular, to be honest. Another part of the spending bill is granting parole to 7 million illegal immigrants, which is guaranteed to include criminals, gang members, and it's a pathway to citizenship for people who cross the border illegally and visa overstayers. You know, this might be a reason why the Democrats have lost Latino support so heavily. One, they keep calling them Latinx, which is stupid. But two, because citizens of this country actually don't like it when other people cut the line and do it illegally and then get benefits from that. It actually feels unjust to new citizens who have done it the right way, who've spent years granting that citizenship. Just because they're fellow Latinos doesn't mean that they don't feel that sense of injustice. The Democrats have completely missed that fact, in my opinion. Overall, this bill creates about 150 new government programs. It's a massive expanse of government, a massive bribery scheme for the American people. All right, what else has occurred in 2021? Again, I'm not sure how this compares to 2020 because that was also bad. Remember when Black Lives Matter riots were destroying cities across America. But let's talk about the crime wave. The crime wave has been going on for a couple years now. And is it Biden administration's fault? No, but it is Democrats' fault for sure. Why? Because they have funders like George Soros who love to promote and fund campaigns for very, very progressive left-wing prosecutors, DAs, judges across the country. Because there are some states like Texas that do elect their judges. And this has caused a disastrous rise in crime across the country. And this is, of course, coupled with defund the police schemes, which certainly doesn't help. But again, I personally think that the real culprit here is this bail reform that's happened, this refusal to even prosecute cases because, it's racist to prosecute a violent criminal, I guess, according to the progressive mentality. Now, that's created some problems. Let's look to Houston, my hometown. It's recorded its 540th murder as of November 17th, which marks a 21% increase over 2020's rate. Now you're like, oh, but Dan, Republicans run Texas, right? Well, no, not in Houston, and not in Dallas, and not in San Antonio or Austin or any major city, certainly not in El Paso. No, Democrats run it. Democrats run every level of government from the county to the city. And so when it comes to this kind of enforcement, when it comes to DAs, when it comes to the county judge who was just elected, a Democrat just elected a couple of years ago when I was elected, 2018, first time a Democrat's taken over, you're seeing a correlation with that and an increase in murder rate. So it's a 21% increase over 2020's rate, by the way, just in Houston. According to the Houston Chronicle, the number of defendants who have committed new crimes while out on bail has tripled since 2015. Newspaper also found 141 cases, 31 of which were violent felonies, where defendants were allowed to pay less than 10% of their bond amounts. We've seen Attorney General Garland, instead of prioritizing this problem, prioritize investigating parents to speak out at school board meetings, calling them domestic terrorists. Meanwhile, the U.S. is experiencing its largest ever single-year homicide spike in 2020, and crime now polls, understandably so, as one of the voters' top concerns. We've always said, look, some perspective is important. Crime is not as bad as the 1990s, but that's actually not true for some American cities now. That's how bad it's gotten. There's some that are flirting with those homicide tallies, and some that have surpassed it. Cities that actually shattered their all-time annual homicide record in 2021, for instance, Philadelphia, Louisville, Kentucky, Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, Austin, Texas, Tucson, Arizona, St. Paul, Minnesota, Portland, Oregon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Fayetteville, North Carolina. That's sad to see. So look, what this all comes down to is the bail reform nonsense. Remember Waukesha, this guy who murdered, I think 6 people, one of them a kid, murdered him for no reason, except potentially racism. If this isn't being investigated as a hate crime, I don't know what would constitute a hate crime. But that's not the point. The point is this guy was let out on bail. This is another one of those cases where people died because of these sort of liberal notions of compassion, where criminals can just be let loose. But who is that compassionate for? It's certainly not compassionate for the victims of these people. This false sense of compassion has to stop. We have to have some kind of law and order. You cannot have liberty without a just sense of law and order. That's a fundamental conservative principle. This opinion on bail reform isn't just an opinion. There is research on it, and it does show that an increase in the percentage of pretrial defendants released pending trial does translate into more crimes committed by that population. One study by researchers at Princeton, Harvard, and Stanford universities found that pretrial release increases the likelihood of rearrest prior to case disposition by more than 37%. Also increases the likelihood of defendant failing to appear in court by 124%. So 2 other studies analyzing the recent bail reform effort in Chicago also found increases in the number of crimes committed by pretrial defendants in that jurisdiction. Moving on to a different topic, some of the nominations from this year. This is really a good news story because these are failed nominations, and these were really bad people that Biden was trying to nominate into his administration. You know, we should completely do away with the notion by this point. If there's a lesson from 2021, it is this, that Biden was a moderate. Okay, now he was elected and won the Democrat primary, and I think moderate center-left Democrats brought him over that edge, and that was what he ran on against President Trump. Some sort of this back to normalcy, just going to be moderate type of language, but he has proven to be exactly the opposite. And these choices in the nominations for his administration are indicative of that. So let's look at the first one I want to talk about. David Chipman to run the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, ATF. Now, of course, this is an agency that primarily, more than anything else, deals with gun crimes. So here's the thing. He's electing a radical to this. Chipman was a former advisor to the Giffords Gun Control Group, but he also openly advocated for banning AR-15 type rifles. Now, fortunately, this was defeated in September by, well, frankly, a lot of people speaking out in the 2A community. This was a good example of good activism, and I think what it did to stop this nomination. There was another really bad one. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is a key banking regulator, his nominee was, I'm not sure if I'm saying her name right, but let's say Miss Omarova. Omarova was an interesting pick. Now, why? Because she talked about being an avowed communist. She was a graduate of Moscow State University, has a long record of advocating for socialism, and even recently proposed that the Federal Reserve take over consumer bank deposits, effectively ending banking. She said that she has praised the Soviet Union for its wage equality, whatever that means. I guess everybody's equally miserable in many ways. She also said, quote, "Until I came to the U.S., I couldn't imagine that things like gender pay gap still existed in today's world. Say what you will about the old USSR, there was no gender pay gap there. Market doesn't always know best." So this is maybe not somebody that we should put in charge of our banks, you would think. Luckily for America, they also failed to get their nominees for the Federal Trade Commission and Federal Communications Commissions through the Senate, which is luckily derailed parts of their agenda. So again, this is more of a good news story. We have been rather successful. If you haven't noticed in this podcast, it's not all doom and gloom. We've been wildly successful, even while being the minority in both the House and the Senate and not holding the White House. We've been enormously successful in stopping their agenda. The Build Back Better plan continues to go nowhere, and we've stopped some of the more radical picks here. Now we just got to win some more elections so we can do a little bit better. Other good news, the Biden administration has experienced some large failures at the Supreme Court. In August, the Supreme Court denied the Biden administration's request to pause the implementation of a Trump-era immigration policy known as Remain in Mexico. That's the good news. Of course, the bad news is the border remains in crisis. We're going to talk about that in a second. The lower court ordered the reinstatement of the program, forcing the administration to appeal to the Supreme Court. The Biden administration argued in its brief that the policy had been dormant for more than a year, and that abruptly reinstating it would prejudice the United States' relations with vital regional partners, severely disrupt its operations at the southern border, and threaten to create a diplomatic and humanitarian crisis. That's a terrible argument and a very weak one. I mean, the Remain in Mexico policy was working extremely well until the Biden administration ended it. It's not as if we forced Mexico to do it. They were doing it willingly. We had asylum cooperation agreements with Northern Triangle countries as well. That was really the disruption to diplomatic relations was what the Biden administration did, not reinstituting these things. Mexico is not a fan, by the way, of caravans of people passing through its country. It's not a fan of this. So they are willing to work with us if we just ask. Luckily, the Biden administration also experienced a pretty embarrassing defeat over their eviction moratorium. Now, again, this seems uncompassionate to say, but you can't. This is not the right way to deal with people who lose their jobs and are having trouble paying their rent. The right way to deal with that is through rental assistance. Right? That tackles the problem right at the source. if you start saying that landlords can't evict people, well, now you're creating a mortgage crisis on top of the rental crisis. That's what you're doing. It's a very foolish policy. It's a very foolish policy intervention. Better one is simple rental assistance, which was already happening. The federal government does give some money for that, and it's instituted at the local level. So that luckily went by the wayside. And Brett Kavanaugh, in his opinion, wrote that the eviction moratorium can only be extended by Congress, which is correct. In other good news, a couple weeks ago, federal appeals court upheld a lower court's order that temporarily blocks CMS from enforcing its vaccination mandate for healthcare workers. That's good news. Again, I don't like mandates. All right, now back to bad news. It's not that far in the rearview mirror, but I think many Americans have unfortunately forgotten about it. What choice do they have, I suppose? But we're talking about Afghanistan here and the abject foreign policy failure that occurred there. We've talked about this ad nauseum, but it's simply worth bringing up yet again. This was such an unnecessary failure on the part of our country. Biden got the same advice that Trump got every single day, which was you really can't withdraw to zero without some serious repercussions. And a conversation about the costs and benefits of doing so was just never had in a deliberate and common sense kind of way. Now, unfortunately, public opinion had swayed so far on this that I think a good majority of Americans wanted Biden to do exactly what he did. And of course, changed their minds right afterwards because we saw what happened. Now, there's this idea that what Biden did was the problem with it was the how, not the what, right? How he left, how he withdrew, as opposed to withdrawing at all. Because you see a lot of people say, well, of course you have to get all the troops out, but just not this way. Well, then what way? See, actually, I disagree with that statement because I wonder what way you're talking about. You tell me what a better way to withdraw is. There is no better way. There simply is no better way. It's going to result in absolute chaos and a vacuum of power and a terrorist safe haven if you withdraw all your troops. Now, you can leave a very, very minimal footprint, which was, again, what Biden was advised to do by his military, of about 2,500 troops, enough to keep Bagram open, enough to keep this kind of base of operations, enough to keep some sort of logistical support for the Afghan military. Again, we've invested this much into it. It takes an extremely small investment to keep it from completely collapsing. So why wouldn't you do that? Honestly, why wouldn't you do that? It's like your house catches on fire. You spend hundreds of thousands of dollars rebuilding everything, but you know what? There's like $2,000 more that you've got to spend to get it to the right place. And you're just like, nope, burn it all down. Let's just start the fire again. It's the exact same kind of foolish mentality. Now, of course, you would never do that to your home, but that's exactly what we did with our foreign policy and with Afghanistan. And yet I'm angry at both sides for this because at least half of the people on the right probably I've been advocating for Biden to do this exact thing and then acted upset when it happened the way it did, which is exactly how I told them it would happen over and over again. Very, very frustrating. Now let's go to the border. This is in more bad news. FY fiscal year 2021 was the highest number of encounters in a fiscal year, 1.7 million. That surpasses the previous record set in the year 2000. Under Biden, the monthly numbers rapidly increased. In January of 2021, there were 78,000 encounters. The next month, there were 100,000 encounters, continued to climb to 160,000. In July, they peaked at over 200,000. So this is directly related to Biden's policies. The revoking the Remain in Mexico policy, revoking asylum cooperation agreements, and generally demonstrating a favoritism, a friendliness to illegal crossings. That's a fact. I mean, he raised his hand when asked in the Democratic presidential primary debates, would you give illegal immigrants health care? Everybody raised their hand, right? Because they wanted to pander to the woke left. Well, people notice those kind of things, right? It gets out. The word gets out. The cartels take advantage of it. And the cartels make a ton of money off of Biden's incompetence on this because they charge what's called a peso for crossing the border, probably around $300 per person. And this is a low risk operation for the cartels because they don't even have to cross. They just have to allow people to come to certain crossing points, because, well, they're the cartels. They can tell people what to do. They just allow people to come to certain points. They put them on rafts and they send them across, and Border Patrol is just waiting for them. Again, Border Patrol is part of the process for them. They're not trying to escape because they know that they have a good chance of being let loose inside the country because we're not really enforcing our laws and we're not adjudicating these asylum claims or these illegal border crossing cases fast enough. That's what's fundamentally happening. If you enforce the law, the system can work. Now, I do think it needs more resources. You probably need more immigration judges down there. We need more space for detention. You do those things, and you can solve this crisis. And you add back in Remain in Mexico and asylum cooperation agreements with the Northern Triangle countries, which basically allowed immigrants to claim asylum in their home country. Which, if you were really claiming asylum, if you really had an asylum case, you would want to go to the first possible location, like a consulate or an embassy. That's what you would actually do. You wouldn't trek hundreds and hundreds of miles across dangerous areas and pay off cartels. No, you do that if you just want to come in illegally for economic reasons. If you really have an asylum case, you want to get to help as soon as possible. And so the asylum cooperation agreements were basically that under Trump. Biden ended those things. And of course, they have good reason to believe they're going to be let loose inside the United States. I mean, this year, more than 95,000 migrants have been released without notices to appear. But merely notices to report. It's a legal difference here. Or notice to report to an ICE office within 60 days. Of the first 50,000 reported to have been given notices to report, merely 13% reported within the 60-day time limit. So this gets to a claim often made by Democrats. They say, wow, like 99% of people show up for their courts. I mean, there's nobody just escaping and that's not true. When they say that, they're relying on data that's like over the course of 8 years and all countries included in it. Okay, it doesn't get at the question of what are people crossing our southern border doing. This statistic I just gave you does. This statistic I just gave you shows that it's actually closer to the opposite. It's closer to 90% do not show up to their court date, because why would they? What incentive do they have? And they also know that this administration wants to decrease a lot of the enforcement mechanisms domestically that ICE normally would undertake. Then, of course, Biden stopped building the wall. He was actually paying contractors $3 million a day to not build the border wall, totaling up to $2 billion wasted between January and July of 2021. Court orders have reversed Biden's decision to end the migrant protection protocols. We went over that earlier. But it hasn't really been re-implemented yet, and they're dragging their feet as much as possible. So that's probably the worst news. I mean, being from Texas, that's probably the worst news is the border crisis. I will say that Texas Governor Greg Abbott has stepped up to do what Texas can to the greatest extent possible, using Department of Public Safety officers and National Guard to demonstrate demonstrations of force to I would say deter people from crossing the border, but also trying to enforce border crossings by using state trespassing laws to do so. Texas is doing what it can, but we need federal help. We need the federal government to actually care about this, and this administration simply doesn't. They simply don't. It's like they've just resigned themselves to the polling numbers that they have right now and are fine with that for the next couple of years while they continue to do damage to the country. But hey, on that cheery note, let's hope for a better 2022. Keep your chin up. It does look like Republicans, unless we really screw it up, will be at least in charge of the House of Representatives after the elections in 2022, where we can put a permanent stop to bad legislation the Democrats want to pass. Of course, doesn't prevent us completely from stopping Biden's agenda. He will still be the president. But on that cheery note, look, enjoy your New Year's. Enjoy your next year. Make some good resolutions for yourself and your family. God bless, and give this podcast 5 stars. Thanks.